Why do we care about climate change? Most of us don't read peer-reviewed papers and come up with detached scientific conclusions. Concern over climate change lives within our society. My parents told me about how humans were destroying the planet. My teachers told me about the greenhouse effect at school. The TV told me, the internet told me. Greta Thunberg, Al Gore, and even Boris Johnson told me. Climate change is a societal force, as well as a physical phenomenon. With this in mind, the history of climate change becomes much more interesting and societally engaged. This isn't a linear story of climate scientists coming up with startling conclusions that are then transmitted into the political sphere. If this was the case, climate activism would have started in 1938, when the basic scientific tenets of climate change narratives were laid out by Guy Stewart Callender, or in 1960, when these tenets were confirmed by the measurements of Charles Keeling. Rather, the rise of climate change discourse is a complex story regarding the utilization and receptibility of climate-based narratives, a story that is still very much developing today. In this tale of how climate change became a leviathan of discourse, the 1970s play a crucial role. There are many reasons why climate discourse was elevated during this decade that have been explored by historians. I would like to focus on some physically immediate drivers that have been name-dropped by historians. Established histories mention a series of climate anomalies occurring in the first half of the decade that generated awareness and heightened concern over climate change and its devastating effects, increasing the political weight of the issue. The most prominent of these anomalies, at least from an American perspective, included a poor harvest in the Soviet Union in 1972 that instigated controversial grain purchases from the United States, a wet fall in the same year in the United States that prevented crops from being harvested, and successive drought years in the Sahel region of West Africa that caused widespread starvation and death, especially amongst populations reliant on pastoralism. At first glance, this seems to indicate that climate change concern doesn't live in our society. It can be transmitted to us directly. Nature can speak for herself, one could say. My paper uncovers why this is not really the case, at least in 1973. The first piece of evidence is that the initial reaction to these climate events wasn't to fit them into a wider pattern of climate change. This may seem strange now, but in the early 1970s, climate change just wasn't on the radar for most people. For example, early responders to the Sahel disaster held a prevailing belief that the drought was a, quote, temporary climatic aberration, and that, quote, each year would be the last. Instead, all three events became sensational for their own independent reasons. If this is the case, who drew the link between these events and climate change, and why did powerful people listen? So far, we have ignored an elephant in the room. These climate events took place during the most monumental reorientation of the world economy since the Second World War. The creaking post-war economic order, the Bretton Woods system, was done away with by President Nixon. The reasons and effects of this are extremely complex, but suffice to say that Nixon sneakily prioritized exporters over possible inflation pressures. In 1971, he told an advisor, quote, "I've never seen anybody beaten in elections on inflation in the United States. I've seen many people beaten on unemployment," unquote. Almost certainly as a result, the prices of various commodities started rising. Food was among them. Naturally, this became a huge political issue as post-war security came screeching to a halt. Suddenly, Americans began to worry if the system could provide the bare essentials. American pessimism and declinism were on the rise during the 1970s, reflected by the loss of utopian visions and the perception that the US was falling behind emerging economies such as Japan. Historian Michael Egan writes that the 1970s, quote, mark a decade in which imminent catastrophe lurked behind shock and crisis. Optimism was replaced with pessimism, progress with decline, unquote. In initial Senate hearings in March, Nixon's advisers ducked and dived, emphasizing the responsibility of everything outside the administration, whether it be trade unions or poor weather. They also promised that things would soon get back to normal, a position that by October was completely untenable. So now we come to Senate hearings in October, co-chaired by former Democratic Vice President Hubert Humphrey, whose introductory statements are a pessimistic tour de force. Quote, "We just never dreamed for a moment that our food surpluses would become shortages. Well, all of that, as we know, has changed, and things will never be the same," unquote. On October 17th, the hearings were dominated by agricultural experts that appeared to confuse and frustrate Humphrey in equal measure. Most experts advocated a less pessimistic view than Humphrey, leading Humphrey to interrogate them to extract worst-case scenarios. However, the next day, Humphrey was confronted by a speaker whose pessimism would leapfrog his own. Reid Bryson served as a forecaster in the US Air Force during the Second World War, before becoming the founder of the University of Wisconsin's Meteorology Department and Center for Climatic Research, advocating and practicing a highly interdisciplinary method of study that sometimes drew conflict with colleagues at Wisconsin. He was known to focus on new ideas rather than detail, looking for completely new mechanisms and theories for phenomena rather than advancing data collection methods. His interdisciplinary nature is reflected by the fact that, unlike most of his atmospheric science contemporaries, his papers often ended by exploring social consequences and making de facto policy recommendations. His writing style was idiosyncratic and polemic, and many of his ideas struggled to gain traction in academia. This would not be the case with Humphrey in October 1973. Bryson began by clearing the table, dismissing most of the complex testimonies before his own. He then relayed the impressive list of climate events, asking, quote, "So the question that really needs to be addressed is this just a bad year, or is it really the shape of the future?" Unquote. Immediately, he followed this by presenting his audience with a graph of Icelandic temperature reconstructed from historical records, making an immediate, comprehensible, and visual impact on his non-specialist audience. He claimed, citing historical precedents, that world temperatures were likely to decrease. I should make it clear that for Bryson, climate change was not global warming, and the terms should not be used interchangeably even today. He then brought in some controversial new theories of his own, saying that pollution and increasing volcanic activity had altered world weather patterns, and that this had caused the aforementioned climate events. Humphrey then explained why he was so appreciative of Bryson's testimony. Quote, "I really looked forward to your testimony today, because almost by intuition and scattered reading, and listening to a number of people in scattered parts of the country, what you are saying to us today, in a very learned manner, is what I have sensed from the kind of tidbits of information you get in this kind of hurly-burly life as generalists in the Congress of the United States." Unquote. From the start of the testimony, Humphrey had wanted to believe Bryson's argument, due to his socially influenced intuition that the real situation was far worse than the economists claimed. Here was a simple explanation for a scary situation. From Humphrey's perspective, although the problem was not yet solved, it could be understood. 3 days later, the Washington Post recorded that Humphrey was visibly stirred at the hearing by Bryson's arguments. It is clear that the complex situation in 1973 gave Bryson a raised platform from which he could air his views with receptive senior members of Congress, and that he made full use of the opportunity to legitimize himself, his institution, and his ideas. This push did not go down well in the wider meteorological community. it seems that some of the most personal attacks were not written down. Stephen Schneider describes how Bryson received abuse. Quote, "To listen to some of the vicious remarks made about Bryson's motives made by some members of the discipline makes me wonder just who in the profession is being most unethical." Unquote. However, Walter Orr Roberts, the founder of the National Center for Atmospheric Research, pointed out that although many atmospheric scientists thought that Bryson's climate theories were conjecture, quote, "some of them also feel that Bryson has done society a useful service by making the public aware that such a climatic development is at least in the realms of possibility." Unquote. It seems that for some atmospheric scientists, although they disagreed vehemently with Bryson's ideas and methods, began to recognize the power of relating climate to food supply, and this link was regularly brought up at important funding summits in the mid-70s. The fall of 1973 represents an important elevation in the political status of climate change. In March 1973, the rising cost of food was blamed on short-term weather and trade unions by Nixon officials, with no mention of long-term climatic changes. By the First World Food Conference in April 1974, US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger told the world that the possibility of worldwide climatic changes had ominous implications for food and population policy. Barely an hour before Bryson's speech in Congress, Senator Humphrey demonstrated that he knew very little about changes to the climate, which at most was an occasional interest. By the end of Bryson's testimony, the former US Vice President was visibly stirred, advocating increasing public funds for an until then minor area of research. Due at least partially to the economic crisis of the early 1970s, climate change gained a cognitive foothold in the fall of 1973, from which it could develop into one of the defining issues of our time. Why does all this matter? Why does it matter that climate change concern came from complex societal interactions rather than from a nature newsflash? It matters because complex societal interactions are pushing climate change narratives today, and climate change is increasingly becoming a conduit for reinforcing, not challenging, existing political and financial power. Climate change concern has made Elon Musk billions. Boris Johnson is using climate change action as a poster for global Britain. Companies across the spectrum are making serious money from carbon markets. We need to fundamentally understand what climate activism should mean. Does it just mean reducing CO2 to save polar bears? If it does, then maybe we should join Elon Musk's carbon capture crusade. Or does it actually mean deconstructing the systems that pushed climate change, both physical and societal, in the first place?